Hello, everybody. It's good to be with you again this Thursday as we look at Philippians. And today we're going to be looking at Philippians chapter 2, verses 25 through 30. And we're going to talk about an interesting person by the name of Epaphroditus. He's quite an example for us to look at. So if you want to, go ahead and read that section of text. It won't take us very long to get through this. There's some interesting things I do want to bring up, but this gentleman is definitely exemplary, and we need to take a moment, a week to look at him. So take a moment to read that and then come back. All right, assuming you've read that, let's talk about Epaphroditus for a moment. The person, we don't know a whole lot about this person. In fact, his name is only mentioned one other time in the entire New Testament, and it's in Philippians. So he's mentioned twice in Philippians, and that's it. I don't think, most scholars do not think, that there's a person by the name of Epaphras in Colossians that is also mentioned, but it seems too much of a stretch. There's too much difference in the name for Epaphroditus and Epaphras to be the same name. So those two are probably separate, different people. But one thing we do know about this person is that he has to be Greek for sure. Well, at least his name is Greek. And in fact, the name itself seems to derive from the Greek goddess Aphrodite. So this person, for some reason, was named after this pagan goddess. Now, again, the person's of Greek origin, so they're not even aware of God like you'd think of a Jewish person or anything like that. And they probably have a family for some reason that was honoring this Greek goddess Aphrodite. Now, Aphrodite is not worshipped a lot in the ancient Near East Mediterranean world or in the Greco-Roman world. She's not really a sign of strength. She's the one, the goddess that's is talked about love and beauty and things like that, and sometimes going into the erotic too. So it can be kind of dicey, but she's not really worshipped like others, where you think of other gods like Zeus, the king of the gods, or the king of the pantheon, and then the others, Poseidon, and some of the others that we know wield, or in the stories they wield power, but not Aphrodite. However, there is an area in southwestern, it would be modern day southwestern Turkey. In the Bible, it would be southwestern Asia Minor. It would be around the area where Paul had his first missionary journey. I think this is critical to understanding about maybe the origin of this person. So around this area in the southwestern Asia Minor, there was a temple that was dedicated to the Greek goddess Aphrodite. So this seems to be the area of the Greco-Roman world in the Mediterranean area where she is worshipped prominently. So perhaps Epaphroditus came from southwestern Asia Minor. It would have been Greek, a Greek settlement for sure, because the Greeks settled this area a long, long time ago. So, but this person has, they no longer follow the pagan practices, pagan religions. They've given their life, that's Epaphroditus, they've given their life to the service of the Lord from here on out. Another thing about this person I think is kind of interesting is that the word fellow soldier that's used to describe him. In fact, that's in verse 25. Yes, 25. He uses, there's some other words there too. I don't want to come back to these, but the fellow soldier one kind of intrigues me because the word that's used there in the Greek, in fact, the word for soldier itself does not appear in the New Testament. But fellow soldier does. But it only shows up 2 times. Here and in Philemon. In Philemon, it's attached to another person by the name of Archippus, which again, we don't know a lot about him either. And Philemon is really a really short letter. There's not much to that letter. It's mostly about the release of a slave. There's not a lot of people that are called fellow soldiers in the New Testament. In fact, the word that he uses, fellow worker, prior to that, now that word is used predominantly for Paul's ministry team partners. Paul always worked in ministry teams. We often think of him as writing the letter himself, but it seems more likely that he was writing with others in mind, and we do know that he had a network of people doing ministry. And I think Epaphroditus may be a part of this network to a large degree. But he's called a fellow soldier. Now, I want to get back to that. This word's not used, but only 2 times in the entire New Testament. And again, it's only used for another person in the letter of Philemon, which we really don't know a lot about. So think about some other people that Paul's worked with, like Barnabas and Silas and Timothy. None of these are given this kind of label, fellow soldier. Usually most of them, as I said, most of the people that he works with, he calls them fellow workers, is what he calls them. It makes me wonder if Epaphroditus may actually have been a retired soldier, ex-military. Seems to fit. And it also, we think about, when you've read the portion, I assume, if you think about what's said about him in there, in fact, that he was willing to go to the point of death for his service for the Lord, that tells me he has a lot of grit. A lot of people won't do that. Even well committed and intentional Christians sometimes will falter. That doesn't mean that they're weak in their faith or anything like that, or we shouldn't be thinking of them in any less terms. There's just some people that have stronger grit than others. That's just the way it is. This person has a lot of grit, and I think that probably kind of lends itself to thinking maybe this person been trained military and been through a lot of conflicts, and so he's probably been at the point of death many times. Maybe not from illness necessarily, but from maybe a conflict or something. Regardless, I think this may be, now again, this is all speculation. I'm just speculating about this person. I'm trying to pick up information from his name, from some other things that I could associate with his name real quickly, and some of the labeling that Paul uses to identify him. Regardless, the person is definitely a good example of the type of Christian that we should be inspired by. Now, another thing about the fellow soldier idea is that the word for soldier in Greek basically just means someone who faces hostility. So it could be used real well for a soldier. I mean, it fits into that kind of way we would think about it. Think about Paul's life, though, as far as we think about facing hostility. Paul had all kinds of difficult times in his ministry. And most of the time, most of the time, except in Philippi, he had some problems with some Greeks, but most of the time he's having trouble with Judaizers. Now remember, the Judaizers are people who they're Jewish people. They have heard the message of salvation in Christ. They've heard about Christianity. Let's just say it that way. They've heard about Christianity. They seem to have made a step forward into Christianity, but at the same time, they're dragging the old covenant practices with them. Things like circumcision, observance of the Sabbath, observance of the festivals, things of that nature. Maybe the temple tax, upkeep to the temple itself. What they're trying to do is they're trying to incorporate old covenant practices into New Testament principles. And even more simply, they're really trying to make people become Jewish and observe the Jewish traditions before they can ever be considered a Christian. That is legalism, and a perfect example, a perfect definition of legalism. Legalism is adding things to the simple message of salvation taught in the New Testament, adding things to it in order to become a Christian, adding things that are not in the New Testament. So they're adding things. Not only is it, an understanding about Christ, but you got to adopt these Jewish principles too, and Jewish lifestyle, so forth and so on, dietary restrictions, these kind of things. And so this is the kind of people that he's fighting against. He's not fighting against secular government. In fact, the government doesn't really care what Paul's doing at this time. Even though he is in prison, he's going to go see. He appealed to Caesar, so hopefully he will see Caesar, but Christianity is not a problem for the Roman Empire. They don't think much about it. In fact, they really don't even understand what's going on. It's such a small minority of people that it's just basically forgotten about in their minds. So it's nothing against secular government. It's nothing against the pagan religious festival practices either. Most of the pagan practices were very tolerant of other types of religious activities. So the hostility that Paul is facing is basically coming from within the Christian community to some degree. And these people who's causing the trouble that I've called Judaizers are really false teachers. That's what they are. So he's battled false teachers in his Galatian ministry. And we see it in the letter of Galatians. He's battled false teachers in Corinth. In fact, 2 Corinthians, he calls them the super apostles, which is really odd. And so he talks about them in 2 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians, he talks about a little bit about it, but 2 Corinthians seems to be a little bit more pointed towards that way. Romans, he expects there to be the same kind of trouble, and so he seems to try to prevent it with his writing before he ever makes a trip there. So he's had this problem, and he expects this problem to continue. And what we do find out in chapter 3 is that there seems to be some kind of a group that are very, very similar to the Judaizers that are described in Galatians. And the idea from 2 Corinthians seems to be the same group again. He doesn't identify them that way, but we have the same problems that he's had before. So Epaphroditus has been there in this contention with this heresy is what it is. These people teaching the wrong things about Christianity, about salvation, about Christian living, so forth and so on. This is the problem, and Epaphroditus has been there with him through it the whole way. In fact, in some sense, you could think of this as being like an inner battle. We still have this today. We have lots of people who try to add things to the salvation process. Many, many things that aren't needed. I'm not going to get into a bunch of examples right now, but just understand this. Be people of the text. If you don't understand the text very well, then you need to do more study. But we've got to be people who understand the text and use it as it is and not add things to it. So Epaphroditus. Now, even more interesting about this person is that he's given another name that's kind of interesting. Now, or he's given a function. He's called a messenger. He's also called a minister. I want to talk about those two words real quick. I don't think I would translate them necessarily that way. Messenger may be more appropriate, but what I find about that first word, messenger, is the Greek word behind it is the same word that we translate as apostle. Apostolos. That's what the word is, apostolos. And so Epaphroditus is called an apostolos. Now, you might be wondering, like, well, how can he be the same kind of person as Paul, an apostle, or Peter as an apostle, or John as apostle, or these other apostles? We have to differentiate some of these folks. This word is used to describe several people in the New Testament. In fact, there's a married couple in Romans 16:7 that are called apostolus, and so or they seem to be a part of the group of the apostolus. In Ephesians 4, we have this office that's been presented. So there is a distinguishing idea that has to be understood, in that we have these people, apostolos, which we translate as apostles, the original 12, who saw the resurrected Lord. Now, of course, Judas didn't see the resurrected Lord, but Judas he's committed suicide at that time of the resurrection. So we have 11 disciples that have seen the resurrected Lord. We have this other person, Mattathias, and so he is incorporated into the group. I assume he may have seen the resurrected Lord. He's one of the disciples. And Paul is called one also, and he definitely saw the resurrected Lord. And so we have that group that you could say have seen the resurrected Lord and have been directed by the Lord, sent as a messenger in order to share some things. And then we have other people that are called apostolos too. And so the idea can have a very general idea of being a messenger, or also being a church planner. A church planner. Now this brings me back to Epaphroditus. I think this word may have been better understood in that sense. Now, I think he is taking letters. In fact, I think he took a letter to Paul, some information to Paul, while Paul's in prison in Rome, in the historical time frame of Philippians. He's taken something there, some information, and he's seeking some aid from Paul. And he may even taken some aid to him also, and he's coming back with some information, I should say, for the Philippian church. He very well could be the one who planted the church. Remember, this place is ex-military. Maybe he was an ex-military person given a tract of land, and he may have been the one that planted the church. We just don't know. But it's kind of interesting about this person. Now, Epaphroditus did not see the resurrected Lord, so he's not in the same grouping as the 13 that I talked about earlier, obviously. But he is given that name, so that's kind of interesting. The word for minister is also interesting. It's not like a person who preaches or something like that. In fact, this word would probably been better translated as maybe assistant. We could have been a little bit more, we could have clarified maybe a little bit more in this context and maybe said ministry assistant. But it's definitely not minister that we would think. In fact, the term that generally we would think of as a minister type of person is diakonos. And so that's the word that we get deacon from. And so many people are called a diakonos. Even Jesus is called a diakonos at times. One time I know for sure. And so those are the people who are serving the Lord's purpose. Now, I'm not saying Epaphroditus is not. He is, obviously. But he is not of the same pedigree as some of these others, is what I'm trying to differentiate. Now, he may have taught in his own church and things, but there seems to be a differentiation going on here, at least between Epaphroditus and Paul, for sure. And so I do think it would probably be better rendered here as maybe, you could have started off maybe, messenger probably would be fine if you understood that, may have had an idea of him being the one who initiated the church. But the second part, in fact, its relationship, as Paul is talking about Epaphroditus' role toward him, an aide or an assistant would have been a much better idea about here. Regardless, he is a good inspirational model, Epaphroditus, for sure. So, it's fun to speculate about these things, but again, you come back to it, all we have is an example of a person who is inspirational. And Christians could draw some good inspiration from this, of how we should take our service for the Lord to some degree. So in verse 26, we find out that Epaphroditus has these strong emotional connections. In fact, the grammatical construction that is in verse 26 in the Greek cannot be reproduced. It can be reproduced, but it'd be very, very difficult in the English language. We would have to add certain things to it. The point in the Greek grammar is that it's really trying to stress a continuous activity sometime in the past. So it's not that he longs, he was longing. And in the Greek, it's even more emphatic in that this kind of construction is very specialized, in that it has an ongoing sense, a continuous activity to it. That's the idea. And so it's really stressing this continuous activity. It is in the past. So at some time in the past, Epaphroditus has these strong emotional connections, and they have continued up to this moment when Paul's writing this letter. He knows about it. In fact, in some ways, I think that we could probably, again, this is adding things, and it's an interpretive translation, and I don't know if we can get this idea in here, but here's the idea. Maybe this will help you understand. Paul would say something like, Epaphroditus, he has kept on talking about you since the time he come, and he has not stopped. That's the idea that it would be. It's like, it's just incessant. His constant concern is for these people, and Paul is very aware of it. He has a strong longing for these folks. Very, very strong emotional connection. He has and he also has a concern about the church's behalf because they have heard about his illness. Now, this is odd. So Epaphroditus, again, I think he's ex-soldier. He has a lot of grit because he did service for the Lord up until the point of death, is what it says. Similar to what Jesus happened with Jesus, except Epaphroditus didn't die. But we have these examples of doing the Lord's work up to the point of death. And so Epaphroditus is this kind of individual. So it's taken a lot of grit, but he's not worried about himself in this situation. He's worried about the church because they've heard of the difficulty that he's faced. So they're wondering about him, and he's worried about them becoming despondent or saddened or grievous because of what's going on. And he wants to get back and tell everybody that he's okay. This is the kind of person he is. There is no self-orientation to this person. He's not selfish. He's not self-motivated. He is others motivated. It is incredible, this example of this guy. It would be so good for so many Christians to follow this kind of example. It is truly, truly remarkable. Verse 27, we find out he was ill to the point of death. We have no idea what it is, but you could just imagine it was some kind of illness. You can imagine back then what it could have been. And Paul basically says that the Lord had mercy on Epaphroditus. I take that to mean that the Lord had some kind of a healing in this procedure. Now, again, it's not spelled out cleanly. It doesn't say it directly that the Lord did this, but it does say that God had mercy on him. And then Paul goes on, he says, and he also had mercy upon me, because Paul has strong feelings for Epaphroditus, that he wouldn't be grieving and grieving and grieving over the loss of his dear, dear friend. So it's really moving what's being said here about this person. Again, just a wonderful example of a person. And I do think from the way this reads in verse 27 that Paul personally interceded on the behalf of this person, which we would expect from Paul. Of course, he's going to do that. He sought the Lord's help, which Paul did often. God healed this person. Now in verse 28, we find out that Epaphroditus is coming back. Again, he wants to get back to let them know how he's doing. But also, there's some problems in the church. He's got to get back and address these problems. There are two problems that are apparent in Philippians. And it's coming up in chapter 3 and chapter 4. So there's a problem in chapter 3, and there's a problem that comes up in chapter 4. The first is false teachers. Now again, these are teachers who they would call themselves Christians. But somebody understanding Scripture and hearing what they're saying and what they're teaching would look at them and say, you are not Christians. What you're trying to do is you're trying to do some kind of a hybrid of old covenant practices, and you're trying to mix that into a new covenant instructions. And so you're formed some kind of a hybrid. It's not Christianity anymore. It's not even old covenant religious practice anymore. It's some kind of a new thing that is not even described in the Bible. This is what is going on. So they are false teachers, even though they think they're right. They are not. They don't have enough knowledge. Another place where it talks about false teaching is in 1 John. So this is a problem throughout the New Testament. There's people who don't have the right amount of knowledge, they don't have enough knowledge or the right amount of knowledge, and for some reason they have not placed themselves in under apostolic guidance to some degree or something. They just kind of went out on their own and caused lots and lots of problems. And it happens all the time. That's probably why we have 13,000 or even more different denominations in the United States alone, because of misinformation so many times and people playing around with this stuff. So this is serious business when you're dealing with God's church. It's something that needs to be handled well and handled professionally and ministerially. You've got to really know how to serve your people according to the New Testament, purely, and not other ways. Regardless, he's coming back, so they got to fight against false teaching. And then in chapter 4, we also find out about these two ladies. Seems to be ladies. Their names are feminine for sure. Euodia and then Syntyche. And so there's some kind of a contention going on. Again, we don't know what the contention is. It could be stemming from the false teachers, but we just don't know. I kind of doubt it is, but I don't think we need to stereotype and say, oh, women act a certain way, and so this must have been what was going on. We can't do that, because most of us are just talking about women that we've known in our own lives in modern day America, 21st century. We would have no idea about Greek women in the first century, that culture or anything else. So we can't use the stereotypical answers here. There's something going on. It's probably something that is creating disunity in the body. And so Epaphroditus has got to get back to handle both of these problems. Paul in verse 29 tells them to receive him in the Lord. But it also says joyously, to receive him joyously, be thankful. I don't know why they wouldn't be joyous. Maybe it's because some of the instruction that Paul is going to give, some of the instruction in here may have hit home too close. I don't know for sure. Epaphroditus is the one carrying the letter, though. That's part of being the messenger. So he is the letter carrier. So he is taking this back, but they're to receive him joyously and honorably. They're supposed to give him honor. people who give a lot to the Lord in their life, in their service, in the Lord's service, should be treated with honor. I mean, that's just all there is. So many of these people have given up things. They've given up the pursuit of money. They've given up the pursuit of power. They've chosen to serve other people. Chosen to serve the Lord. And so, as Epaphroditus should be treated with honor, the same idea is in our Christianity today, as always. So, people who really are out there doing, serious work for the Lord, they need to be respected to some degree. And then also, this is another example of just a person living very, very humbly. I mean, this is just a good example for us. Epaphroditus is just a person who is humble, and obviously he is very submissive to the Lord's will. And then in verse 30, think about verse 30. He is completing some kind of a ministry need for Paul. Basically, Paul says that I don't think he's trying to be harsh here. I don't think he's trying to accuse the church in Philippi of planning to neglect him in some way. I don't think that's what he's trying to say here at all. What I think he's trying to say is, all of you couldn't come. Epaphroditus is the one who was able to come, and he was able to give me what I needed in order to continue on. In fact, in chapter 4, he's going to talk about financial security with his ministry and mission work or whatever else. Epaphroditus is the one who's been able to come and help out Paul in this need. And it could be financial help, and it probably is. Like I said in chapter 4, we do have financial help, a talk about financial help anyway. But again, Epaphroditus is just a good example of someone who lived humbly. He was compliant to God's gospel ministry. I mean, that's God's desire, gospel ministry. So he was compliant to that, and he gave it his all. It says all the way to the point of death. When we think about two people, we have Jesus, who basically was obedient all the way unto death, and then you have Epaphroditus, who did the Lord's bidding all the way unto death. Difference is, Jesus did die. Epaphroditus does not seem to. It's not a resurrection. I'm not suggesting that. Epaphroditus did not die, but they were both willing to go to that point. And then we have Timothy, who's very, very sincere. That's what it says about Timothy. We looked at Timothy last week. He is sincere. He's genuine. When we start looking at Paul in comparison to the Judaizers, that's going to be Paul's argument. I am a sincere Christian. They are not. That's going to be the idea presented here. So we have examples of sincerity, but also of just that gritty determination to do the Lord's bidding. These examples in Philippians are really inspiring me. And I'm going to preach through Philippians probably sometime in next spring, but I look forward to drawing out some of these interesting points as I've been studying the text. And I hope that you've found this to be interesting also. Let's stop right there. Next week we'll deal with chapter 3, and I'll get started on chapter 3, and next week will be really exciting as we talk about the life of Paul. Have a great week, and I will talk to you later. Bye.